fellow travelers, and welcome to Versus Stars podcast. All my loyal listeners, thank you for your continued support. And remember, click that subscribe button, everybody. It's an amazing episode because aboard the mothership is Kevin VanHook. He's the co-creator of Bloodshot. Now he's the executive editor and lead writer of Visi8 Entertainment. Come aboard as we go traversing the stars. Hello, Mr. VanHook. Thank you so much for coming to the Traversing the Stars podcast.
Thanks for having me.
It's a true honor to speak with you, sir. You're one of the legends of comics.
Oh, that's very kind of you. I appreciate that.
No problem. So I always start with a question of inspiration. So what inspired your love for comics and who your earliest influences?
Inspired my love for comics. I started off, I picked up my first book when I was 8. It actually turned out to be, although I didn't realize it, how important a book it was at the time. It was the Bernie Wrightson Swamp Thing with Batman in it.
Oh, very cool.
So just bought it on at a convenience store in Kentucky and bought it several more books. My mom didn't like the idea of me just keeping them around, so she insisted I sell them to my friends and neighborhood kids, and I had to sell them for half of whatever I paid for them.
Oh, no.
Didn't want me taking advantage of it. I was selling a lot of books at like 12, 13 cents a piece because the comics were like just starting to be 25 cents a piece at that point. And then I wasn't really around comics for a little while. We lived on a farm after that. And 3 or 4 years later, my brother had a high school buddy that lent him a year's run of Fantastic Four. And I fell in love completely. And I got hooked. It was George Perez's stuff. And just thought he was just such an incredible artist. And got hooked and started making that my goal. That's what I wanted to do, was to draw comics, and I eventually did.
So did you ever make the mistake of going back and seeing the value now, the comics you sold at half price back in the day?
Not the very early ones, but I know of other ones that I had to sell for various reasons along the way that are worth a whole lot more than I sold them for. When I was 13, I bought an issue of Spider-Man #1 at my local comic shop on time. I convinced the lady to let me give her $40 down and $10 a week. And she's at Comic Kingdom in Detroit, and she let me do that. And even though they didn't have a policy about like layaway, and she thought it was kind of funny, but she knew I was sincere about it, and I did it. And I held on to that for a few years, but still sold it. There was a certain point where my folks hit a bump in the road and needed help with a utility bill. And I was still in high school at that point, and sold it for like $187. So I made money. It's a book worth several $1,000s today.
That must be a killer. My father tells stories of selling these comics when he was a kid later as well. And yeah, the ones I hear that him sold, I was like, oh man, that's brutal.
There's definitely, and at the time I sold them, I always sold them after being 8. I always sold them at a profit. So, so in the early 80s, I sold a big chunk of my X-Men run because this was right after Byrne had left, and pretty much probably actually around the Paul Smith run of X-Men. So like 170, something like that. And because I was starting to do martial arts, I was starting to do a lot of tournament stuff, and I needed gear. So it's always weighing which thing do I want more.
So knowing that you've now become an extremely successful comic book creator, has your mother, who's made you sell those comic books, ever said anything about like, oops?
No, sadly, she passed away a long time ago.
I'm sorry.
That's all right. It happens, but she did get to see me the early stages of my career being successful, and but I don't think it ever occurred to her that she would have done anything differently with an 8-year-old boy in his comics.
So as I was saying, you've had an amazing successful career in comic books. So what has your experience taught you about story creation over the years?
Well, a lot about actual story creation. I mean, it's there's a lot to it. I mean, so I'm really big on story. So not just in comics, but as a filmmaker, also as a screenwriter. And so I'm very big on story structure and the idea of a beginning, middle, and end. Obviously, there can be entertainment that doesn't necessarily follow a structure, but at the end of the day, most of your classics pieces of entertainment follow some sort of beginning, middle, end structure, and they follow some sort of a whether it's a 3-act structure or not, there's some kind of a guideline or a paradigm for how you tell a story, and I'm very comfortable with that.
So you recently joined Visi8. Is that, am I pronouncing it correctly?
Visi8.
Yeah, Visi8 Entertainment as their executive editor, advisor, and mentor and writer. So you've had multiple many jobs. You're very busy with them. So what intrigued you about this company? Because it's a new company coming out from Indonesia. How would you help them to avoid the mistakes of the other fledgling companies, new ones that came up and like Virgin that and didn't quite make it?
Yeah, it's always a challenge, and our market, the comic book market's challenging right now in particular. You know, when I started off, there were really Marvel and DC and a small handful of independents, period. And those independents that I'm talking about we're talking about in the days of Pacific Comics and First Comics and Eclipse and Fantagraphics, doing their own thing. But there really weren't a whole lot there wasn't a whole lot of competition out there, and it really was Marvel and DC and everybody else. And we also had 25 distributors roughly back in those days, and they weren't necessarily equal weight, but Diamond and Capital City were pretty large, and then everybody else kind of filled up the remainder. And that all changed a lot 25 years ago when Marvel did their deal where they bought a distributor and vertically integrated, and then realized, oops, we don't know what we're doing, and kind of sent everybody to Diamond for a long, long time. And then that got disrupted 2 years ago. So when I'm talking to these guys, to Visi8, I'm trying to give them that history with a sense of just be aware of the state of flux it's in, and be aware that, it was from the ground up. These guys were primarily people that came out of entertainment in terms of visual effects and animation, and a lot of tech stuff, a lot of AR kind of things, and not really comic book storytellers. And so trying to teach them the medium, but also teach them the business of it and make them understand. So I had to let them know that today you have very few choices for distribution to comic shops, and these are who they are, and so on. So they came over from Indonesia in July, and we set up at San Diego Comic-Con, and we met with Diamond and made a great impression with them. And then 2 weeks later, we signed a deal with Diamond. So, and then we just recently did the Diamond Trade Show Summit in Baltimore and Baltimore Comic-Con. So there's a lot of me kind of explaining, this is how the industry has been, this is where I believe it is, and these are the concerns I have. So a lot of the stuff I'm stressing are, we have to be on time, we have to keep the quality level where it needs to be, the craft of lettering, that craft of storytelling that moves the eye through a page, all these things that if we break panels this way and this way, then you start reading the pages out of order, the panels out of order, and as long as you know what you're doing, you can break the rules, but you should know them before you break them. And so it's running the gamut of all of that stuff, and advising them on what I think is best in terms of advertising. And I hooked them up with a printer that prints high quality books. We're with Avenue 4, which does a lot of mainstream comics and has a great relationship with Diamond and can get the books there on time. So it's really all of that stuff. It's everything that it takes to make a comic book, solicit it, sell it, and hopefully hang in there. We'll see what kind of numbers we get. We're trying to get the word out and advertising and doing the conventions and so on. But it's a different world than before. When I helped start Innovation Comics in 1980, end of 88, when we solicited our first 7 titles that first month, we sold on average 18,000 copies a piece. We were devastated because we were basing our numbers off what we had done a couple years earlier, around 35,000 copies each. And now 18,000 would be something that a lot of publishers would dream about. So it's always interesting to see what is that, what's the minimum? I mean, for years, Diamond wouldn't continue to carry your book if it didn't sell at least 5,000 copies. Well, a lot of titles don't sell that today. So it's, something I'm always telling these guys. I said, we just be aware that we can do everything right and still not necessarily pull great numbers, but I have confidence that we've gotten great reaction. The retailers are excited about it. They're telling me based on their numbers, I think we're going to do very well based on the feedback we've gotten. But it's just you never know.
I think I've been a comic book fan for 30 something years. And I think the fear of every comic book buyer when dealing with a new company, let's say CrossGen, I think Big City or some of these others, is the fear of starting a storyline and having it just stop.
Right.
How far ahead have they basically like guaranteed we're going to cover this long, we'll let it build at least this long before something happens? So for
they've repeatedly said they're in it for the long game. So it's and I met with their financier, and while we weren't talking about that specifically, we were actually talking about a much bigger picture in terms of developing these IPs for television and film and a theme park and other things that are all legitimately in the works. He says they're in it for the long haul, and they're very patient. So I believe them. The Changelings, the first title that I wrote, that I have written, that comes out in February. So these first two books are Kara, Guardian of Realms, and Changelings are in the current Diamond catalog that came out last week. They ship in February. Changelings, I have written all 7 issues of the story, so they're being drawn, and then they're on like issue 4. So that's moving along just fine. Seventh Tiger, which is another title. We're still debating on what month we're going to start shipping, because the financier would love to see like all 12 issues in the can before we release one. I've explained that that's kind of unheard of in our industry. A lot of times some of my most famous titles that I've been associated with, including Bloodshot 1, we only had a cover and when we solicited, so there was nothing else beyond that. It's great to see that. It's just that means just that just necessitates a long period before we release, because we've drawn like 4 issues or 3 or 4 issues of it. So
the company itself is out of Indonesia. Now it's being marketed to the United States, and I will say United States, we're kind of a United States centric personality for like we think about a lot of this. How will you connect the stories from Indonesia with the American audience?
Well, I'm a large part of that equation. So I have a track record of writing and drawing successful books in the West, and so I'm ensuring that specifically the stuff I'm writing is associated or very accessible to an American audience. So what I'm doing is I'm doing things. All of our titles have some aspect of Indonesian or Southeast Asian culture to them. Some of them deal with touchstones of their history. Some of it's just a fantastic or fantasy version of their culture and mythology. But at their heart, they're solid storytelling. So they're very very accessible, I think, to the West. Changelings is, and it's as accessible, probably more accessible than manga, and manga obviously is very successful.
And I think one thing I thought was very interesting is their 10-year plan, like I said, ends with a theme park. That's an extremely ambitious plan for 10 years. So how does that ambition motivate the direction of the company?
Well, for one, I should already say this, they already have the land and so forth, and they've already started elements of that, including things like moving towards designing a resort and so forth. So I spent 6 weeks with them in Indonesia, traveling from one side, from the west in Sumatra to the east in Bali, and spent time with their financial people, with the creative people, and our artists are spread across the country. So I actually would fly from one city to another to meet the artists who are drawing my books that I'm writing. So that was great. I think it impacts it just in the sense of just kind of an eye towards that eventual goal. if I had had my druthers personally, I would have built a cohesive universe across the board, meaning that like the Marvel Cinematic Universe or that kind of thing. But they really wanted to do certain titles that don't really completely play ball with that. And so I can say that the books I'm writing do interact and can interact. And to a lesser degree, some of the other ones I can play in their universe as well. But but some of them are difficult just because the nature of what they are. They're set in different time periods and sort of a fantastic alternate world kind of a thing. It's just gotta be so.
So as you said, your first book is from Visi8. It's called Changelings. So what inspired the creation of the book, and how does it demonstrate the company's overall vision?
Overall vision, I'll answer that first. It deals with a lot of mythology and cultural touchstones that are very specifically Southeast Asian in terms of how magic and demons and things are spirits specifically are viewed. As far as the other aspect of it, what I decided to do was I wanted to do for a long time I'd had the concept of doing a changeling child book, and at one point I was actually going to do one for DC Comics, and then DC was a great place for me to do work with, and I loved working with Dan DiDio and Mike Martz and these different folks who I had a chance to spend time with on titles. But DC had a tendency to get excited about a project, let's go forward. I would do my part and then come back and go, oh, we've already changed our mind, we're doing something else now. And that we did that several times, and the magic thing was one of them. So I'd always kicked around this idea of changeling children. So just using that little aspect of something I was thinking about years ago, I've pitched this to these guys, and originally it was going to be two male figures and swapped at birth, a demon child and a human child swapped at birth, and then that they would, and the basic premise was that they had to essentially fight periodically. And so moving beyond that, what it became was a female human child and a male demon swapped at birth. And ultimately the idea is that this happens throughout history. Every now and then this takes place, and they have to essentially have a contest to over 5 totems that they have to retrieve. And they retrieve these through battles with creatures or monsters. And so the first one is a kaiju, the second one's dragons, the third one is a volcanic man, and the fourth one's a three-headed man and three-headed giant. And so it's this kind of unusual series of contests where the human child has been banished and raised in this demon world called the Hantu, the spirit plane of the Hantu. And she's sending these creatures to our world. And it turns out that the kid, even though he was a demon by birth, is really Earth's champion. And he's a better human than most humans. And he has to take on this battle and try to win. And we show little flashback moments, which is pretty cool, where every now and then throughout history, we've seen this happen again and again. And we show sometimes when humans lost. And so things like Krakatoa blew and we were plunged into 40,000 years of nuclear winter and things like that. So, but we see these characters, different physical bodies, but essentially they're those souls interacting. And it's fun, and it's beautifully drawn by a guy named Ramat Handoko, and colorist is Sakti Ubono, and he's just really good too. They complement each other really well.
I will say I had the pleasure of reading that first issue, and I thought it was fantastic. I really enjoyed what you did with the first of Changelings. And I'm actually want to quote a line from the comic, if you don't mind. So just sure. So in the first issue of the Changelings, there's a giant monster, a kaiju-like, a massive monster, and you write in the caption, "Did not ask for the dark voice to come, didn't ask to be born." Now, I was wondering if that relates as well to the protagonist, which is named Arga, and how much agency does he have in his destiny?
I think it relates very much to Arga, and it is kind of reflecting his thoughts. Although, as you know, and I know you're reading it out of context here for the audience, but that where you're reading specifically, it is talking about the kaiju. Mm-hmm. But as far as agency, one of the things that is told, and I'm not giving away too much, I don't think, is that Arga, we learn, remembers everything. So all these past lives I'm talking about, he remembers all the defeats and the conquests and all that kind of stuff. Whereas Drajana, which is the female demonic human, doesn't. So she's destined to repeat a lot of the same mistakes. And so it's interesting that you pick up on that and ask, because I think that's a big part of the sort of theme of it.
So when you said he remembers his past lives, I'm trying to think the best way to frame it. Does he remember them as his past lives, or is he remembering that these individuals in the past has had these lives? And how affected is he by these memories of experiences that aren't necessarily his?
We show it by the fact that, like, because I'm doing these flashbacks. So one of the flashbacks is when he's like 8 or 10 years old, and he has a nightmare, and he wakes up and goes into his mother's bedroom and tells her what he just keeps dreaming about this fight. And it's a fight that he has had in a past life. So he remembers them as if it's him, but he doesn't quite understand it. As he grows older, he realizes what these memories are. One of the other things that's fun in the book too is we realize, because he's very attractively drawn young man, and we will reveal that that's a glamour. That in that sequence with the little boy that I'm talking about, there'll be a great moment where we see him in shadow, and we just the lights are off, and he's just sort of backlit by the hall, and we see this little boy with a stuffed teddy bear in his arms and ram's horns. And then
Cool.
when the light comes on, he's just this cute little kid. And then we echo that later on in the series when he's a full-grown man, and it's a full-grown demon. So it's
very cool.
Yeah, it's something I'm very excited about. I'm really happy about all the stuff I'm working on with these guys.
So as someone, I kind of like harp on words, and I get that I find them very important. So, a word that's used to describe Arga is the word enchanted. Now, by definition, enchantment is something that is done to an individual normally. So what's the nature of the enchantment, and what is the relationship to whatever did this to him?
And the first series does not answer that question. So it is posed, because at the end of the day, Arga is kind of like, okay, I know that I've gone through this countless times through history. We have a great sequence where we see a steampunk version of these characters going to battle, and I even get to tie in Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, which I had a great kick doing, because to me, as a writer and a fan of fiction, you can't mention Sumatra without my brain saying The Giant Rat of Sumatra, which is a Sherlock Holmes story that was never written but is referenced. So I reference it myself in my story. But and then I actually got to go to Sumatra, which is very cool. The answer as far as the enchantment is somebody or something has enchanted him, and that's part of that swap. The concept of changing children, historically, culturally, often is associated with like Gaelic mythology, with the idea of like goblin children and so forth. And we're kind of touching on that, but not specifically. And because of sort of the idea of us keeping things set in Southeast Asia or Indonesia specifically, we're really only telling those stories. We are kicking around the idea that there are other similar contests going on around the world. That's not just those specifically, and they would answer other great cultural moments like Pompeii and so forth.
Well, that's cool. That sounds absolutely awesome. Are you going to introduce these others at some point?
That's the idea. That's what we're talking about. So we've just verbally agreed that a tentative plan is to do another 12-issue run with these characters immediately following these. And the idea would be then that there are some other great mythological things. One of the things that I would probably use as a driving catalyst for it is mythology about sea witches in Indonesia, very specific goddesses and demonic forces that come from the sea. And one of the things I should say that I find interesting is a lot of times I'll write these fictional concepts or I'll have ideas, And then when I start doing the research, even after I've written like the first book or draft of something, my research will end up bearing out everything I just wrote, that there's some reason for that. I did a movie called The Fallen Ones years ago, and I had written that this fallen angel had been in the cave with Lot and his daughters and had slept with one of his daughters, Rachel, and that was part of his great sin, why the Nephilim, the fallen angels, were the offspring of the fallen angels, were wiped from the face of the earth in the flood. And it's part of Genesis, and it's just kind of vaguely touched on in the book. But I had written the script, and my main fallen angel character was a character named Aman. Well, it turned out that Rachel had a son named Amin, and that he was the founder, basically, of the Ammonites. And so it was like all the stuff that I just remember that feeling at 2:30 in the morning or so, looking through a Bible to try and kind of make sure I can have a couple little references that would sort of sprinkle in, that would sort of give what I'm writing some basis, and then finding the story, and it's like, okay, it's verifying everything I made up.
That's awesome.
And I found that a lot on this stuff that I'm doing with the Indonesians, which is really cool.
That's cool.
Because there's a whole thing. There's a tiger in this that's actually a kitty cat, and we introduce it as just a cat, like a house cat, and then turns out it's a were tiger, and she's his protector, Argus protector, and turns out that there's actually a whole mythology about that very thing in Indonesia.
That sounds really cool. So when thinking about Arga, is he a reluctant hero, and is this something that he was created as a part of? Is he being forced into this? How does he feel about the situation that he's in?
The way I tell it is that he's just very tired. He's emotionally tired from this, because he is a good person. He was raised by a good family. He knows his origins. He knows what he's capable of, and he is magical because of those origins. But he feels that he's a reluctant hero in the sense that he feels that he's forced into this destiny all the time. And one of the things that you'll see in the actual books, I'm not sure if it was in the preview or not, I need to go back and make sure it's in all of them, is one of the opening lines in each title is a quote about reincarnation. And so there's one from Mahatma Gandhi, there's one from all these different people. Einstein, I think, has one. And then the last one is, and so they'll all start with, some sort of quote and then their name. And so in the last issue, it is, "I am so very tired, Arga."
I can only imagine what it would feel like to have that many lives. I guess that would be exhausting. Is it more exhausting the journey, or is it just the pressure of it?
I think it's the pressure of it. I think it's the fact that he knows that if he fails, that humankind could be plunged into darkness. That essentially the demonic forces will win, and they'll run rampant. And there are things in the storyline that we plant that gives you the impression that and it's true that he might not win this time. And then there's a great couple of reversals that are told. So, but yeah, I think it's the pressure of it. I think it's what my intention was with that. Just the fact that, everything he's fought for and his parents lived for and so forth would just be gone.
So the antagonist at the moment is Durjana. Is she a victim of circumstance, or is the darkness her choice?
I think it began as victim of circumstance. She's just a baby, a little infant that was swapped at birth. So, but she has become very much an evil creature. And where I'm going with it is the idea that this whole concept is nurture versus nature. So that it's the child that was born in a demonic world is actually the good person and the protagonist, and the child who was born in a human world is actually the villain of the piece, and much more demonic than any of the demons. She's ruling the demons. And we also have a neat thing in the storyline where we see a wall of history that's sort of hieroglyphs. and that she goes and she studies these things because she doesn't have the memories that Arga does, but she sees these things, and she's looking at trying to learn from what she can interpret from these diagrams that tell of the past victories and failures.
So, what are her goals? Let's say she wins, right? And there is that massive catastrophe, Krakatoa, whatever. What does she get out of the victory?
In this case, it's literally this sort of classic rule of the world thing. So it's more or less. There's a great mythology tied to Indonesia that says that just off the coast of Indonesia was Atlantis, and so part of her quest is to raise the city and to rule from Atlantis, from the throne room, and essentially bring all of the demonic forces into our world, where they would essentially run rampant and feed on the souls of human beings and plunge humankind into darkness. Essentially remake our world into what her world is in this little small cavernous area that she has lived in.
And she states in this, like I said, I love using comments from the books because it was well done. So to John, she comments that she would have been trapped in a world of humans like herself. So I kind of want to parse, like, what does that she mean by that exactly? Trapped in a world of humans like herself. What does that mean?
Well, I think that she views humankind as weak, and she detests that part of herself that she defines as that's her weakness, and so that's what she's referring to. It's the self-loathing that's coming out that way.
So is she trapped then as well?
Yes. Yeah. So part of the story is that they have these contests, and there are certain milestones that happen, and if she gets so far, she actually gets to come to Earth and finish out the plan from here, as opposed to just being on the other side. And and she makes that happen. So that's one of her goals.
And as you're saying, like, she reincarnated, she's had multiple different lives. So the Dojana that's here now, does she then have to be evil because that's her role? Or is she, how much freedom does she have to choose to be this person?
I'm going with the idea that she has the freedom of choice, the free will, but inevitably humans are flawed and will not make the right choice.
I've been around enough people to agree with you 100% on that one.
Same here, unfortunately. So,
like I said, it really sounds like a fantastic story. And the first issue ends with a suggestion that there's a team around Arga. Is that true? And how does that connect?
So, as a young man, he started recruiting this team. He was already older than his years. So at 10 years old, he ends up meeting a 17 or 18-year-old Setia, who is, if you'll look at that last page, he's sort of the big guy with the tattoos. And Arga was being chased by a street gang, and Setia saved him from his own street gang because they were trying to beat up a 10-year-old kid. And Arga introduces himself, and it's like, you need to come with me. We've got stuff to do. And so he convinces him, and then they recruit Uma. Uma has special talents of her own, and so they bring her into this thing. And so she ends up, she and Setia essentially build a small army, and their job is to basically support him and kind of deal with other supernatural events. He's primarily focusing on the big picture stuff, but we get the impression that there are other little events happening all over the world that they're dealing with.
Now, Arga, once again, as someone who's had past lives, does the people in this team exist in the same sense? Has the other past Argas always had a team around them?
It's the same people.
Okay. Very cool. So there's a strong thread of faith that must be going throughout this story.
Yep, there is, and it's kind of cool getting to play with a foreign language and trying to not screw up, because it's a very different language than English. What's called Bahasa Indonesian, and just trying to use the names the way I like to use names. So, we end up with, when we do see flashbacks of like the steampunk version of these group, these people in the group. Their names are variants of the modern day versions. So it's clear who they are. For an Indonesian speaking group in particular, they would look at it and go, it's like, oh, I get it. That also means mountain. That also means companion, that kind of thing. And so that's a cool thing for me, just because I just like the language. But it's very much fate. And we also say that sometimes, even though in this instance it's a male Arga and a female Dajana, that it's not always the case. So we show a volcanic eruption in the past where it's reversed, where the demon is the male figure. And so it's no particular reason other than just to say it's not about gender. It's just about the essence of the human.
So to go back to the idea of fate, it sounds like there is something at play that allows this stuff to carry on through generations. Do you dive into it all, the nature of the thing behind this?
Not in this first 7 issues, but that is the question we walk away with at the end of the 7th issue.
All right, I can't wait to read all these issues. So when and where can our listeners find Changelings?
Shipping February 22nd, here in a few months. All comic book shops that get their books through Diamond. It's in the catalog now. There's order forms will be turned in here in about 3 weeks. So we're hoping for people to ask their comic shops and so forth to pick them up.
Well, I want to thank you very much, Mr. VanHook, for stopping by the show. Changeling sounds absolutely awesome, and I hope Visi8 is there for the long haul.
Thank you. I do too. I'm great people, just really wonderful people to work with, and I would be remiss if I didn't just point out that shipping along with Changelings is Kara Guardian of the Realms. I'll get the name out right, which is written and drawn by Triandika Anjani, who's just a wonderfully talented young lady. And so great stuff. But it comes out either the week before or the same day as Changeling. So we'll have 2 books there, and then I've also got the Frank Miller Presents Genie book that I wrote, comes out that same month. So I'm actively back in comics. So
well, it's very good. Glad to have you back, sir.
Thanks, sir. I appreciate it, and thanks for reading that. That means a lot to me.
Absolutely no problem.
Right, you too. Take care.